Alright guys, HyDra here and today. Hope you're doing well and enjoying your day so far. When OpTic won this year's Call of Duty World Championship, one of the big dramas over the coming days after that event was whether they had a massive advantage due to the home crowd cheese, the fact that it hosted the event, the drums on the main stage, the OpTic Dynasty walkout, all of these other things. But Sib has some interesting comments to say on the home crowd buff that OpTic tend to have. Sib reckons that it's actually incredibly difficult to play against that kind of energy, and OpTic are playing effectively twice as good when they have effectively a fifth man on their team. Does this actually apply in esports? Is this a true phenomenon? Is this just an excuse for teams that have lost to OpTic at this big event? Very much interested your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. As I say, the final weekend at Road America here for Kremp of his championship campaign this season. Speaking of some of the greatest ever, number 3 all-time on Ronnie's list went to none other than Karma. Of course, look, what a player, what a career. It was interesting to me that there was like so much debate on this in the comments as to whether Karma should be third or should be higher, really. Because it wasn't that long ago in COD history. Certainly when Karma retired, he was unanimously considered to be the greatest ever. Basically, everyone would have said that, you know, the GOAT, whatever. That was what he was known as at the time. Of course, he was on that Seattle Surge team. He called it a day. But shortly after that, Kremp also won that year's World Championship. And then on Dallas Empire, went on to have more success over the next season. And then certainly in the Vanguard season, when Subliners won an event, of course, they made that crazy run to qualify for the World Championship. Kremp put some more kind of lines on his arm where he's got the tattoo of the amount of event wins that he's won. And after that season, people then really considered Kremp to be the GOAT. But even then, after a season like, you know, Cold War and even Vanguard for Scump, when Scump won the event at the start of the year, Scump was then considered over Karma as well. So I think that if Karma kept on playing, I actually still think he'd probably be considered the greatest ever. But he decided to retire when he did, and those extra couple of years that Scump and Kremp played probably made the difference in putting them above Karma. You know, you can argue it though. I think Kremp quite clearly has to be above Karma on, you know, the history, the amount of tournament wins. Unless you really value the fact that all of Karma's victories at the World Championship were on LAN, which is not the case for Kremp or Clay, because one of those, of course, was online. But look, nonetheless, I think this is fair. The other one that you can argue, though, is Karma over Scump. You possibly can argue that the other way around, depending how much you value World Championships, because, you know, Karma was a phenomenal player. I think underrated in terms of his actual pure ability as well. Like an absolute slay and superstar way back in Black Ops 2 and other games like that, then made the transition to playing for a more team-orientated style, often caught a lot of flack on OpTic Gaming when they weren't winning, often found himself as the scapegoat of the team, but, you know, people really recognize his contributions in hindsight. But if you massively value World Championship rings, then you could argue Karma over Scump, because Scump's only got 1, Karma has 3, but, you know, I personally have it Karma, Scump, Kremp. That's my top 3. We'll see what Ronnie comes up with. That's probably what he's going to say as well. Speaking of the top 20 though, Drazah does slot in at top 6. This I thought is, as I said yesterday, very interesting, right? Because we talked about Cellium, the fact that Cell is very rarely not the strongest AR on his team. This year you can definitely argue this, and that's what the panel of voters, including myself, decided to vote for. And yeah, this is the issue for FaZe, right, is that Drazah was actually really good this year. Certainly given the teammates that he joined with Simp, aBeZy and Cellium, it's been very difficult for anyone over the last few years to get any real, you know, massive impact on the team when teaming with those guys. But that's basically what happened. Yes, his search and destroy wasn't the best, but his respawn play and his impact in the respawns was right up there. And obviously this goes hand in hand with Cellium's impact in the respawns being lower than maybe we expected. Part of that is probably Drazah taken over a bit, but it does raise questions, right, for the team on what you do. Because yes, we know that potentially there's drama behind the scenes with Drazah and those guys, but he was still their second best player this year behind Simp, I would argue, and it's difficult to make a change for him if that's the case. And I'm sure that FaZe are also thinking, if they are thinking about making a move, well, you know, we've obviously kept the trio for the last few years and changed out the fourth, and it's never worked. This year, the fourth played better than ever, and yet we still have the same issues. So maybe it's time to work through it. Maybe it's time to consider something else. But I thought commendable, really, performance from Drazah. Just above him, though, goes to Dashy, top 5 player of the year. And I think this is honestly great to see from Dashy, because his numbers are nowhere near as good from like a pure KD level than they normally would be, and that you might well expect given his pedigree over the last few years. years. 1.05 overall KD, 1.06 adjusted KD because of his slightly better search and destroy stats than otherwise expected, only a 1.02 in hardpoint, but heal time per 10 minutes, 85 seconds. Number 1 in number of hardpoints with, 100 seconds of heal time, number 1 in clutches on LAN, number 1 in most heal time in an online map with basically 3 minutes at 2 minutes 59. So, what a season from Dashy, of course, capping it off with the World Championship victory as well. In some sense, had a bit of an up and down season, right? But I think that these numbers on the top here, like the hill time per 10 minutes, pretty much always number 1 or very close to being number 1 in his category as an AR for soaking up the time. And even stage 4, which was terrible for OpTic, Dashy still held his own to some degree. It was really Pred that had a big fall off there we talked about yesterday. And then, okay, his World Championship wasn't the best, but he still had his moments, of course. And, let's not forget some of those clutches he pulled off in Search and Destroy in the middle of the year, which made a serious amount of impact. And we're going to discuss in a second here the perspective of Sib on this. I did think it was interesting, though, just to mention, because this is in the article we put together here on the Breaking Point site, talking about Dashy and OpTic in general. But this was quite an interesting paragraph, really. OpTic was the top hardpoint team in the CDL, finishing with a league best 61 in 26 record. They led the league in several key metrics, including average margin, points per hold opportunity, and map 4 record 28 in 10. Their consistency was evident both on LAN and online, where they secured an average win margin of plus 40 basically on LAN. The team excelled in fundamentals, ranking 3rd in holding, 3rd in breaking, and 4th in rotation percentage. Notable records as follows. So, not necessarily the best at either holding, breaking, or rotating, but one of the best in all of those categories. So, I just think it's interesting, right, that clearly OpTic were a very fundamentally sound team this year. You could see that in some of their series against New York earlier in the season, when New York were not playing anywhere near as fundamentally well as OpTic were. And what we're going to discuss in a second from Sib is not the only reason why OpTic are good, right? Clearly, they fundamentally were also a very solid team. But did want to show another clip here from this episode that Attach did with Sib. Thought it was very interesting from start to finish, to be honest. But he talks about, towards the end, his kind of experience at the World Championship, how it felt playing on the main stage in front of that crowd. And honestly, I was not surprised, but I think the crowds definitely got to New York to some degree. As to be fair, it got to every team, probably including OpTic, right? I think Dashy was feeling the pressure, Pred was feeling the pressure, but when Pred feels the pressure, he gets better, right? And I think the same is true for Kenny, same is true for Shotzzy, and the same might well be true for Dashy from now on, having now secured that World Championship ring. But this is Sib's perspective on exactly just how difficult it was.
And then, of course, you guys went to champs, got second. Of course, you wanted that ring, but still a pretty good placing. You beat some good teams. You pushed OpTic the distance the first series. What would you say about COD champs as an event as a whole? Was that the loudest event you've ever played at, you think?
Yeah, for sure, the loudest event. I told you yesterday I was using white noise. I never used white noise in my headset. So that champs event was the first event where I had to use white noise, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, go to show how loud the crowd really was.
Yeah, again, we choked first 2 maps and then won the 3rd map. So realistically, we should have been up 3-0, but that's just something that you really can't teach. You just kind of have to capitalize on when you have an advantage in a situation. So, and if you don't, then ultimately that's going to be the result. So,
of course.
And on top of that, I do think the crowd is just gassing up OpTic every play. So
yeah,
they're just going to be playing better and better, and
they're building off that energy and momentum, right? And just they're going to roll with it.
Yeah, so the other team, whoever's playing, them in a grand final or any match, just really has to they have to make twice as less mistakes, and if they do make mistakes, they have to try twice as hard or do twice as much to actually get out of it, because basically you're fighting 2 people and it's 1 guy. So
yeah,
that's really what it comes down to, and we weren't able to really fight back.
Just a quick comment, really, on what Sib was talking about there, just because, he said, we should have been up 3-0 or whatever. I guess you can argue that on some ways, map 1, the first map, Karachi Hardpoint, they were in the lead, 212 to 186. They could well have won this map. New York, they didn't, of course, but in hindsight, they'll feel like they could have done. They're up 114 to 49. They could have won it. The game 2, of course, let's not forget what happens there in that very final round. The Kismet making the play when he was standing on the vending machine. He hops off, gets gets gunned by Shotzzy, loses 3v4, and then they actually did win the map 3 Karachi control. So, you know, this is one of those situations that they will look back on and think, damn, we could have won that. But the other point really was about the crowd, right? And the drums, as we can see here, the OpTic Dynasty walkout and all this. And there have been some hilarious comments and memes about this, really. Even the other day when Dashy was dropping 50 in scrims, people were saying, oh, well, you know, I know why this happened, because Hitch was there behind him banging the drums and all this. So I don't really want to dive into that drama again and whether it actually provided an advantage or not. What I'm more interested in is, does a home crowd just generally provide a boost to teams? Because, you know, you see this in regular sports, it seems, but in esports, you know, they've got their headsets on, they've got the white noise, you know, should it really matter? I think it does still make a difference. Now, does it make as much of a difference as Sib is saying? Because his point is basically, it's twice as hard to play against. They effectively have an additional man. You have to make, you know, twice, or basically you have to make half as many mistakes if you want to be able to win. You have to clutch up twice as often. And I wonder what other players would say about this. I'm not saying that Sib's kind of perspective is necessarily wrong. Maybe other players felt the same way, that the energy of the crowd was just giving OpTic like an extra level. That's not OpTic's fault. I mean, they've deserved this in many ways, right? OpTic have built a lot about their fan base and built the scene over the last few years. They've earned the fact that they are going to have a lot of fans in the venue wherever they are around the world. I do remember one specific example of this being in person way back in, it was World War II, right? CWL Birmingham 2018, the first event that I ever attended. The grand finals there was Luminosity versus Splyce. Splyce was this team of Tommy and Madcat and Jerd and Bance. That was the team of 4, and they made an incredible run through the losers bracket, I think it was. They took down OpTic Gaming, right, on the side stage to make it, I think, to top 3. And then they played a series against Rise, who were like a really good team at the time, Rise Nation. And Splyce were having at that point, obviously after OpTic were out, it was now, because it was in the UK, Splyce were getting all of that home support. And they played some of the best COD that I've like ever seen. They like annihilated Rise. They were like 50-point clubbing them in the hard points. Like they had insane momentum. The crowd was spurring them on. So, you know, I've felt it. I've seen it in person when this type of stuff happens. It can definitely happen in COD. And then unfortunately for Splyce, they got to the grand finals. They again were playing Unreal the first series. They reset the bracket and then they just ran out of gas, and eventually Luminosity won the event. So I think it definitely is a thing in esports, right? Even if it's not always OpTic related, as I just said, the Splyce example, like the European teams back in, you know, Europe, when we used to have events back in the UK, which unfortunately isn't really the case anymore. I think the same is true here to some degree. How much difference it made, of course, that's another question. I'd also think it like depends on the player to some degree. On the other side, it depends on the player on the team that's getting the support, whether they feed off that momentum and hype and energy, and it depends on the players on the other side of the stage as to whether they, you know, they can cope with that energy properly, or whether they falter under the pressure, as it were, and all the taunting and all the noise from the crowd. I guess the other thing that people would say is, oh, Sib, you're saying that you'd have beat them without noise. That's kind of like, you could read into it to say, well, if the crowd wasn't there, if it was an open situation with no fans, if it was entirely neutral, then Subliners would have won the World Championship. Now, you know, you can look at that either way. The reality is that they played in scrims the other day. Not a massive deal. It's practice, but obviously OpTic got the dub here, for example, on the 6-star hardpoint pretty emphatically. So bit of questions on that. Intrigued to your thoughts as always in the comments below. Speaking of OpTic, I thought this was a little bit interesting because we know that Cloud9 involved in multiple esports. What their future's going to be, who really knows? But of course, there's been talk, why aren't OpTic in more esports? And Hex is talking about Counter-Strike and the possibility of a return over there. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.
You walking them all out right now?
Are there 5 guys? I want all of them.
Is there 5 guys down there?
Hey, fucking hold that,
Jose.
I need all of them. They're missing a guy. They're missing a fucking guy.
Hey, you see, it's
Who's the 5th? I need you guys to tell me who
It's a pink out tomorrow. It's a pink out for you tomorrow.
No,
Jose.
Guys, listen, I'm trying to communicate with him if you guys don't mind.
That's a fucking pink out for you tomorrow, right?
Jose.